Historians like to talk about big consequential changes in society, some big dramatic and exciting and fun-filled things. Less often people talk about things that don't change, what is persistent, or what the French called the longue durée. Even though we're in the context of the Industrial Revolution, for most people at the beginning of the 19th century, life hadn't changed. So we're going to look a moment at the traditional home economy. How did people live? What kind of food did they have? What kind of clothing did they have? What kind of shelter did they have? And all of that is centered around hand production and local resources. Most people did not experience a direct impact in industrial production until the end of the century. So the traditional home economy persisted, stayed the same for most people throughout the 19th century. So we can start with clothing, right? So on one end, there are the poor, and they're having either modified animal skins or, some more likely than not, a woolen product where the wool from a sheep is then spun and then woven into cloth and then produced as shirts and pants and hats and jackets, all of the things that people are going to wear. They have one or two sets. Most people didn't change clothes on a daily basis. Most people didn't change clothes on a monthly basis. Most people didn't change their undergarments unless on a yearly basis, right? There was a prejudice against bathing. And so people kept their undergarments on and they wore them all year round. And as it got hot, they took things off. And as it got cold, they put things on. They're not going to have clothes that they're going to change on a daily basis if you're incredibly poor. And that was 50, 60% of the European population. These garments would be homemade. Somebody, either in their home directly or in their village indirectly, made these garments in their home, homespun wool, home woven wool, home sewn wool. They're not going to go into a store. They're not going to go shopping. They're not going to find a variety of things. They're going to have something made and they're going to wear it until it wears out, and then they're going to get something to replace it. The rich, on the other hand, right at the other end of the scale, do have a lot of options, and the highest class option they had was silk. Right? They too could wear woolen products, but wool is itchy. They would much rather prefer something of a finer product or a finer quality. And so through the 17th and 18th century, the British government, the French government, European governments as a whole began subsidizing either the importation or the home production or the domestic production of silk. And so if you look at all the paintings in the 18th century, what you'll notice is that the people are wearing silk stockings, they're wearing silk clothes, pants, shirts, because this was a sign of high social status. These people, right, these very wealthy people could have multiple sets. And this, again, was a sign of status that they could change clothes on a regular basis. They still didn't bathe on a regular basis, but they could at least change clothes. And so there's a big continuum depending upon how rich or how poor someone was. In the middle, right, you have people that could wear the same suit for a week. They may change their shirt, but they're still going to have fewer than the amount of clothes that most people today have, where you can change clothes on a daily basis. You can wash them and wear them, where you have it probably 15, 16 shirts at least. This would have been incredible luxury in the beginning of the 19th century. The distinguishing factor with these products is they were tailor-made. This would add to the expense because you'd have to go in, a tailor would measure your body and then cut and assemble the materials just for you. So once again, the idea of going shopping was really a foreign idea in the beginning of the 19th century. There weren't a lot of shopping centers. You would walk into a tailor, you would pick out the material, you would pick out the style, and a tailor would make it for you. When it comes to food, as a general rule, high population density means a large percentage of your intake comes from vegetable calories. Low population density, meat calories. It is much harder to support large populations on a primarily a meat diet. It is much easier to support large populations on a vegetable calorie diet. So when you're talking about urban poor, they're going to get a lot of vegetable calories as opposed to even the rural poor who have an opportunity to get a few more meat calories. But there is a clear dividing line again between where someone is on social stratification and what type of food they're going to eat. So we can put forth a continuum. On one side is subsistence, and this is the poor, right? Because this is what's required to stay alive. And on the other side, luxury items that are available to the rich. Rich people, right, are going to be adding in the things from the poor. Whereas poor people will rarely eat anything that's going to come from the rich side. So this is cumulative, right? As someone rises in wealth, they're going to add things into their diet. Because at the bottom of a diet are oats. This was used to feed both horses and humans. Oatmeal, oat gruel, oat bread, augmented by nuts, any variety of nuts, including acorns. Acorns are a pig food. But if you're poor enough and that's what you can have, you can grind that up, create a meal, and you can eat that too, right? Because any food is good food if you're starving. Root vegetables, carrots, onions, celery was just starting it was a relatively new introduction into recipes. Leeks, turnips, anything that could be grown in the ground that was going to be non-perishable over an extended period of time. In the middle, jump up a step. If you're going to start adding things to that diet, the next thing you would add into that diet, if you're in the middle, is cheese. Whatever your local cheese is, each region in Europe has its own specialty cheese. So you get all the varieties from Parmesan cheese to Swiss cheese, mozzarella cheeses, cheddar cheeses, right? All of these are named for products that were locally produced. They're locally consumed. Cheeses have the benefit, they're not going to spoil, they're not going to go bad. They can stay around for a while, right? There's no need for refrigeration because the processing creates a stable product. You're going to add to that diet, then you're going to add eggs. Eggs are a sustainable source of food where the chickens are going to be able to wander around and you'll get eggs. But let's think about this for a minute. If you're in an urban environment and you're poor, you're not even going to have a yard or a place where your chickens can wander around and you can get any egg production because you're not going to have a place for your chickens. That was something that the rural poor could have. But as you come into an urban environment, then that's going to have to be bought at a marketplace. You're going to have cash. You're going to have to be able to buy that excess. A step up from that would be occasional chicken, right? maybe once a month, because the chickens are there to lay eggs. They're not there to eat. And so you eat, a European would eat an older chicken after it had finished its life cycle of producing eggs, because you want that sustainable source of food coming in. Above chickens are then pigs. Pigs have a longer life cycle or gestation period, mature period than chickens. It takes a while for them to grow up, but they do pretty fast. They have lots of babies. Pigs, like chickens, eat almost anything, so they're not really high maintenance. A whole variety of pig products can be turned into sausages, cured meats, salted meats. This is also another specialty item across Europe. Each place has its own salamis and prosciuttos and whatever local type of seasoning they have for a sausage. Some places have blood sausages where they take the blood of the pig and mix it in with the meat and then smoke it or cure it or cook it, and this dark blood sausage. This was considered a delicacy. But if you don't have a place for a pig in your yard, then it's going to be something you're going to have to buy in the marketplace, which means it's going to be limited. The meat is going to add, if you're just above the poverty level, you can add meats in as flavorings. You can add bones in as flavorings. So we're talking about adding things along a diet, not necessarily taking things out of a diet. If we go then all the way to the rich end, they have wheat bread. And first, there's the whole wheat bread, and then there's white bread. The whole wheat bread is with the whole part of the cereal ground up together, the wheat and the bran. But then they eventually learn how to separate the bran from the white product, so you can get a white bread. But that removes most of the nourishment, but it gives a much softer texture to the tooth. Right? It's not as chewy, it's not as rough, but it doesn't have as many minerals. But the very wealthy people like that soft, fluffy bread. And so basically the whole wheat bread was a step below. That would be your daily bread. But then you get this rich bread that eventually can be turned into things like cakes. You don't make a lot of cakes with oats. Oat bread is thick, it's dense, it's not light and fluffy. So at this other end of the scale is this wheat bread. Beef added at the upper end. Beef is a very expensive product. It takes a long time for a cow to have a baby, raise a baby, get it into a position where it can be slaughtered. So beef products were a luxury, not added into a daily diet for the vast majority of Europeans. They're not going to say, beef, it's what's for dinner. And then the luxury items, they had a whole host of exotic things. Tea, coffee, cocoa, chocolates, any of the spices, the big spices, the curries, the cardamoms. The basic spice was pepper, right? That may be available in a middle-class home. Sugars available in a middle-class home. Added to those luxury items, right? If you could take some cocoa and put a little sugar in it, be sweeter. All of these things have to be bought at market, right? These aren't things you can make and produce in your own home. In order to go buy them at the market, then you got to have cash Poor people don't have cash. There's less cash in the middle. There's excess at the top that they're going to buy these luxury items, many of them foreign. But this is all a food continuum that persists through the 19th century, so that the vast majority of people are not benefiting from, quote, a global trade in spices and in sugars. All of that comes later in the 19th century. But then we have to ask ourselves, well, what did change even in the traditional home economy? Because something changed. If you look at this population map or the population chart from around the world, you can see that around 1800, right? Around 1800, right here, something does begin to change. Well, that change that boosts this big spike in population are basically potatoes and maize. Potatoes and maize made their way into Europe after 1492. 1492, Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue. Potatoes and maize are a new world product, a new world resource, a new world commodity. These could be grown in Europe. Only with government subsidies did European farmers, European peasants start growing food or growing potatoes and growing maize, but not until government intervention did they even start eating it. They had all kinds of tricks to get people to try to eat the potatoes or eat the maize, because these are foreign products. It's not what my father ate. That's not what my grandfather ate. But once they did, these were high sources of calories. Higher calories meant more babies survived in their first year. More babies survive in their first year. They're going to live to adults. Those adults are going to have more kids. So there's a rapidly growing European and world populations that happen at the beginning of the 19th century, and they really have nothing to do with industrialization. It comes by introducing two new plant products into the diet that poor people can add to the oats. Potatoes, poor people can add to the oats, maize or corn products. And if you add those into a diet mix, it allows poor people to have a better chance at surviving childhood into reproductive years. Those two things really have nothing to do with mechanization, but they have a lot to do with urbanization, because fewer people were needed in a farm economy to feed more people. In Europe, in the 19th century, fewer farmers fed more people. That allows this population boom to grow. If we look at the traditional home economy from a shelter point of view, once again, we can put rural poor on one end, rural rich on the other, with what we traditionally call then the middle class, right? The bourgeoisie, someone who lived in an urban environment, because they weren't quite as poor as peasants who work in the field, and they weren't quite as rich as people who could live out in the country estate. But they did have a more comfortable lifestyle right there in the middle. So if we look at then the housing for a rural poor, you get a cottage. A single family lived in a one-room cottage. The walls were either made out of mud or stone or wood. The floor of the cottage was made with exposed, beaten dirt. So there was nothing really on the floors. If you've ever been in a barn, you'll notice that the barn is incredibly compact, even though animals are walking around it all the time. But because it's sheltered from the rain mostly, and it's just going to be hard dirt. You're not going to have to mop it. You're not going to have to sweep it. Mostly that hard dirt would then be covered with things like hay, which allowed people to then, in the springtime, do spring cleaning, rake all of that out as you would do in a barn and replace it, because during the winter, animals lived inside these cottages. People would bring in whatever animals they had because you want to leave them outside and they would freeze. The cooking place was a hearth, basically an open campfire. So there would be a hole, or in this case, a modern reconstruction has like a chimney there, but this chimney is just to let the smoke out. But many of them simply had a cooking place in the middle of the floor, away from the walls. So the whole environment inside was smoke filled. The roof was a thatched roof, leftover grass from the field, where you harvest the wheat, you harvest the oats, and what's left over are the stalks. You don't throw that away. You bind that up and create a waterproof roof over your head. The windows were simply shutters. Somebody wants to live in this little cottage, so they've put glass windows. That's not authentic. A window was basically the same thing as a door, except it didn't go all the way to the ground, right? A door is something you can walk through. You could go in and out of a, quote, window, right? The window is the opening. It's not the glass that's there. So Europeans had shutters, wooden shutters that they would open and close, basically keep them closed at night, but open them up whenever it's nice outside to let the air come to circulate through. But you want to close them at night in case there's any bad things that would wander into your cottage. Moving into an urban environment, not only was it the family that lived in this building, right, this home, but it also had servants. So if there were any, quote, hired help that were going to participate in the family economy, a butcher, a baker, a tailor, whatever the family business was, they would bring on a male or a female helper, and they would live in the building themselves, right, in the home. The basic layout is a 2-room layout, where the bottom floor, for example, was a single room, and that was a shop. It could be for a cobbler who's going to make shoes. It could be for a tailor who's going to make pants. Could be for a baker who's going to make bread. Whatever they do, they're going to do on the bottom floor, and that's a public space. Up above would then be the living quarters, and the simplest way is just one room, and that's where people slept. Now, if you look at the picture here, then you see that on one of these streets, the front-facing, quote, window would also then have like a big shutter where you could lift up and sell whatever wares right out of that bottom room, right? Because that bottom room is a public space. To add to this, if you're better off, right, if you can have a better thing, basically you double everything. Right? On the bottom floor, there's going to be 2 rooms. So your front room is going to be a public room, and then maybe your back room is going to be the storage facility or whatever private needs to happen back there. And then up above, you can maybe separate up above into 2 rooms where you have, the proprietor's room for where the proprietor lives with his wife and kids, and then have a servant's quarter. Or you can go to the third floor, and in the third floor is where the attic. That's where the servant. You put, if you're wealthy enough, you can put the servants up there. But everybody's living in the same home. The outside of these buildings generally started being made of brick. Brick is more fire resistant. Obviously, there's going to be lots of wood in the building product process, so it is still dangerous. But by building more, by incorporating more brick into building, it makes them more fire resistant, because fire was a big problem in the 16th and 17th centuries as cities grew. The walls were paneled. Could be a wood paneling. It could be not a panel per se, but it could be a mud covering, like a stucco. The bottom floor may be tiled. Once again, as you add up, adding tile adds an expense. Moving upstairs then, but that's, the floors are going to be made of wood, because you're not going to support a tile floor is going to be very hard with the types of wooden bracing that you have. These homes did have a fireplace, and fireplace are a relatively recent invention. By recent 15th, 16th century is when fireplaces started happening, because fireplaces radiate heat. Fireplaces do not simply move smoke out of the room, right? Fireplaces are not simply a place for a fire. Fireplaces were specifically designed to absorb and then radiate heat into a room. Much more comfortable than a hearth. Even if you go back into a medieval castle, they will have a place for a fire, but it's like a hearth. It's not gonna do the job of a fireplace. The roof was made of tile. Most European cities started replacing wooden tiles and wooden roofs and thatched roofs with tile, once again, because of the fire hazard. It is very easy for fire to jump from one to the other. So European governments started regulating fireplaces, they started regulating roofs. They wanted to do as much as possible to reduce the hazard to the entire community. Windows were small, and by windows now we're talking about glass windows, because all of the glass products had to be blown by hand. And so if you've ever watched glass blowing, they're going to take a tube, they're going to spin it around, and you can actually see some of the old windows that, even though they're square, you'll see that it's a round design, because they're blowing it, they're spinning it, they're going to tap it down. And originally it was like a circle. They're going to cut it out and put it in a lead place, a lead frame. Most of the windows were immovable, because you don't want to risk breaking the glass, because it's expensive to make. If there was going to be a movable part, it may be small, right? 8 inches, 6 inches. As people step up in wealth, they're going to add bigger movable windows. And as the price of glass drops, they can add bigger movable windows. But in the early 19th century, people weren't, simply didn't have the luxury of having an opening window. If they did, it was still going to be more like the rural poor, and they had a shutter that would open and close, and the space was simply open. You can see on the street then that the density in urban areas was much higher. The human density, people were living much closer to one another. People shared a common wall. This was a feature of European cities going back into the Middle Ages, right? This is a feature of city develops going back to the Neolithic period. Not that odd. At the other end of the scale then were the rural rich. These were multi-family, multi-room homes. The one I have on the screen is a very simple chateau, but it illustrates what I'm talking about, where almost universally the bottom floor was the public space. And hopefully you can see that you could sort of divide this public space, and where the simplest way is you have a hallway down the middle and there's a public space to the right and a public space to the left, right? That would be a simple two room space. Or, right, you can have right and left, but then front and back again. So you may have a sitting room on one side where ladies would sit. You have a study on the other side where men could sit. The upper floors were the living spaces, where there was a single bed for whoever the occupant was. And in these homes, more likely than not, they're multi-generational, where you have the noble dad married to the mom, and then the kids with them. And even when those kids get older, they might likely stick around for a while. All the way up at the top in the attic, that's where the servants lived. And generally speaking, those servants didn't really have families. Most of them didn't. If you're going to have a maid, it's going to be an old maid, right? Not going to be able to get married, not going to be able to have kids, because their job is going to be to work for the family they're in. If you have a butler or a manservant, their job is to be take care of the men. They're not going to have any family, but they're not going to come from your family, right? So whoever owns the place is going to be inherited from their ancestors, and they're going to live here, and they're going to have their kids and their grandkids, and they're going to bring in servants that are going to live all the way up at the top. The construction material used for this are finished stone, large pieces of stone, polished stone. The walls are definitely going to be some type of paneling, wood paneling, and on there are going to be tapestries. If the walls do happen to be a stone exposure, they're going to cover it with something, either panel or tapestry, to try to keep the heat in, because stone is incredibly cold. The kitchen would be separate from the house, because kitchens run the risk of fire. And so there may be some type of fireplace in the home, but that fireplace is simply for heating. It's not going to be for your normal cooking. Once again, the ceiling is going to, or the roof is going to be made out of tile. And at this level, you start getting the introduction of large movable windows. If you're going to live in a house like this, more likely than not, you can afford a large movable window, all the way up to the King of France, who introduces this concept of French doors, where he was so filthy rich, he could build windows that swung open and close, right? 6-foot windows with those little glass panes up and down. They're 12 feet high, open up, you can open it up into the world. This allowed people to move in and out from a balcony into the living space, right, inside. If you want to close yourself off from the environment, they close up, and you've got protection from the wind or the cold or the rain. This increases the risk of breaking, it increases the expense of making. And so at the time, right, having a set of French doors was a sign of social status and incredible wealth. These types of houses, right, these homes persisted well into the 19th century. This pattern of living didn't change much. What changes in the 19th century is this. In the 19th century, there are more and more urban poor. That on the outskirts of town, more and more people move into and need a single family home. And it's not going to be a workplace. It's going to be a sleep place. Because the people who live in those single family homes are going to walk to the factory. So the modifications or the changing in the traditional home economy don't really come at either of the extremes. They come in the urban living environment, where the urban poor have a scaled down version of what the bourgeoisie or the middle class had been using for generations. Builders are going to come in and build row houses. Some of them could be a single family cottage, a single room cottage. If somebody was able to pull enough resources, maybe they could add 2 rooms, or maybe they could go up. But they're cheaply made, quickly made, and they don't have a lot of creature comforts. And people are packed on one another. None of these people, right? Whether it's the rural poor, the urban middle class, the rural rich, none of them have running water. None of them have flush toilets. None of them have hot showers. They don't have closets. Right? So the whole layout and thinking around a traditional home economy stuck with and stayed persistent into the 19th century. And it's not until the end of the 19th century that our modern home environment starts to take shape. Even though it's in the midst of this industrial revolution. The industrial revolution had limited impact on the home economy.